You know, I'm really impressed with the program that you've got outlined here. And Greg, to you and your associates, much to your credit, because you know, there's a lot of potential in Alaska. The problem always is getting it off the ground and getting it underway, and that's what trade is all about. You know, looking out in the audience, I'm impressed with Mickey Becker, because I happened to see her smile back there, and she said she's retired, and if I were active, I would make it a point to unretire her, if that's such a word that you could coin. I found over the years, when you want to find out what's really going on in the oil patch, you make sure you know Mickey, and she somehow, without divulging, manages to steer you to an appropriate pipeline. But we're going to talk about something else today that's on my mind, and it's on my mind because it's one of those issues that's been laying around for a long, long time. And you've all seen this map. I think this probably personifies a thought process to people who've never really reflected on what's going on at the top of the world. And the close proximity associated with Asia on one hand, with Europe on the other, and when you show this to, I suggested that these be placemats at the meeting in Fairbanks last week of the Arctic nations when they transferred the flag over. But anyway, Brian couldn't come up with enough placemats in time to get them up there. Is that right? Nod your head and say yes, Brian. Okay. Well, enough of that. I've introduced my son. You know, an international diplomat once said of his counterparts, they never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I kind of think that typifies where we are when we talk about transportation in Alaska. It's one of those things that has been hanging around for a long time, and we've seen numerous studies on the idea of connecting the Alaska Railroad to the Canadian and U.S. transcontinental system. Because, you know, here's a big piece of real estate. The only problem we had is we came into the Union in '59, and the railroads quit building west in about the turn of the century. And they never really looked beyond us. For whatever it's worth, there's a little tickler though. The authorization for the Alaska Railroad was 1,000 miles of track in Alaska. We built about 500. Now I'd like to make the case that not only has the federal government authorized us another 500 miles, but with that authorization goes an appropriation. Isn't that fair enough? I mean, hell, they gave every other section of public land to the railroads to build the railroads to the Pacific Ocean. Of course, they stopped when they got done. But in any event, it's an argument that might make a few rounds in a watering hole, if that's appropriate. So we're dealing with a concept that's not new, and my involvement in it, as you indicated, Greg, is Governor Walker, I guess, was looking for something that day other than working on the legislative problems associated with what they're doing or not doing in Juneau. But I won't go down that pipeline. He said, why don't you get involved a little bit and dust off your interest in the railroad, because I know you'd been working on it back in 2000 or thereabouts. So I agreed to pull together, you know, the studies that have been around, and I want to make sure everybody understands I'm not here to build a railroad or determine which route is, or to solve the First Nations problems. My interest is to bring it up to an elevation where it's an issue that addresses a government-to-government interest, a mutual interest, that it's in the interest of Canada and the interest of the United States to have this rail connection, and I'll go into a little of that now. But in any event, the governor said, why don't you go ahead and do it? And I said, well, Governor, I'd be happy to do it, but I'd have to do it under gratis, free gratis. He quickly accepted, which I appreciate. So that's the understanding. I get my expenses, but all my contribution is gratis to the state of Alaska. And we'll see what they can get for a freebie once in a while. But my again, to bring this up to a federal level, government to government, I think makes the most sense because it gets involved the legitimacy of the effort. If the Canadian government is in favor of it, if the Canadian government finds it's in their interest as well as the U.S. government, then I think we've got a significant milestone advanced in our process. So I'm doing an in-depth review, excuse me, an in-depth review of efforts to identify the single most important thing. In your railroad business, you've got to have tonnage. Where's the tonnage going to come from? We talk about the potential of the tonnage, and there's no question about it. This railroad idea involves roughly a 50-mile corridor on either side, which is 100 miles of corridor, through some of the richest areas known in North America to contain significant mineral potential. There's forest products as well. But what's happened over a period of time, as they've developed petroleum products in primarily Alberta, they have discovered huge volumes of what they call bitumen. It's a gravel, oil, kind of a soupy mass, and the volumes of it are significant in relationship to, well, let's go out and drill an oil well. You might drill a dry hole. You don't drill a dry hole. You know what you've got. You know what you've got to transport, and you know the technology of recovering a product that's marketable, and I'll get into that a little bit now. But what has happened as a consequence of the huge discoveries of bitumen and the interest of Alberta in moving that to market are, okay, how do you move it? Well, the logical way is by rail, because the alternatives of moving it south in the pipeline that was recently approved, what is it? Keystone, that goes down to the Gulf refineries primarily. That's where it's going to go. So as a consequence, the bitumen that is in this huge deposit has been identified in volumes that are a little hard to comprehend. They're so significant. One proposal is to take the bitumen to Delta, Big Delta, and as you know, the pipeline comes through Big Delta and then goes down to Valdez. The idea would be by rail, bringing the bitumen up to this area around Big Delta, and then what you do is you either mix it with solvents or heat it, and you recover the oil, and then you put the oil in the pipeline, and away it goes. Now, the significance of that is, well, what kind of volume are you talking about? It's been a while since I have choked on my own lunch, but the significance of moving the volumes we're talking about is really what it's all about, because for the first time we can identify significant tonnage that hadn't been comprehended previously. I think they figure that you can move roughly an equivalent of 1 million barrels a day by 6 trains going each way, covering the distance from, say, Fort McMurray to Big Delta, in which you'd process it, put it in the pipeline, and export it out through the port of Valdez. We've had some discussions with Alyeska, and obviously they have an excess capacity down in the port of Valdez. There's no question about that, and their ability to handle it. The question of the economics, of course, are what's going to drive which of the bitumen deposits reach the Pacific and how they go. Because there's another proposal, and that's to use the port across from Anchorage, Port Mackenzie. And what they would do there would be to rail it, similar to what the way they rail coal to that port, and then export it over to Asia. Now, those are the two prospects that are currently being promoted by Canadian companies. And these are development companies. One is called ATA, Alberta to Alaska is the name of it, and the other is G7G. And G7G goes back to about 2013 and has a similar commitment to try and identify enough tonnage. Primarily, their efforts were prior to the bitumen deposit discovery, hard metals that would be developed along the right-of-way. So if you start looking at what's different today, you have to recognize that when we were looking at the merits of the railroad previously, we didn't have the identification of the tonnage associated with the bitumen. Now, those two projects, ATA and G7G, are very active. I talked to one of the principals this morning, and they're proceeding with financing, they're proceeding with discussions with the Chinese. The other group, G7G, is far along in working with the First Nations. And Canada has a little different situation with their Indigenous people. They've yet to resolve their land claims. So as a consequence, all the potential tribes and regions are involved in the right-of-way and what kind of participation they would want or what price they would want for access across those lands. And that's something that is business. The Canadians, I'm not going to spend any time in it because I think the effort that my contribution can be most effective is to try and bring the issue up to a national issue. And there are other considerations in this that address the national security interests of both Canada and the United States, and that's the missile defense system down at Big Delta, where the Department of Defense has indicated some time ago that it's in the national security interest of the country to have a hard rail connection to Big Delta. Now, the obligation of our defense treaty with Canada includes coverage of Canada with that missile defense system. So I just bring this up to point out another significant contribution of what a rail line would mean to the national security interests of both Canada and the United States. Now, curiously enough, when I was in the United States Senate, I got a bill passed, and it set up a U.S.-Canadian structure, and it passed the United States Senate, the House of Representatives, and the President signed the bill. It became, we signed it I think in December of 2000, and it was Senate Bill 2943. And it authorized a joint U.S.-Canadian commission to study the feasibility of connecting the rail system in Alaska to the North American Continental Rail System and other miscellaneous purposes. They always throw that in because somebody might come up with something else. But the commission was to be made up of 20 commissioners, 10 from each side. And the significance of this is these were presidential selections. The 10 from the U.S. would be appointed by the President of the United States. And we assume that if Canada supported this, the 10 from Canada would be appointed at that same level. So it wasn't just an ordinary commission. It was a commission to study the economic viability. And the specific reference to Canada was the Minister of Transportation. Now, the University of Alaska, through Professor Metz, played a major role in evaluating the estimated tonnage that is potentially economically viable. Some more tea. And that study is available for anyone that cares to evaluate it, but it is quite extensive. And what it does, it leaves you with the chicken and an egg deal. You say, geez, all these potential huge deposits of this, that, and the other thing, they're all over the place. But there's no transportation. So they might as well stay in the ground, and that's what they will do until we get this rail line built. Now, I've already indicated the companies that are currently active, but I think that there's a couple of other things that need identification, and I'll go a little further into the makeup of this particular legislation, because what it does, it gives us a jump start. This legislation was passed into law, but it was never activated. In other words, the commissions were never appointed. The law, I've checked with the parliamentarian, the law is still in force. I have a copy of it for anyone who is interested in the status, and it's very, very comprehensive. In the development of the bill, there was a requirement for the specific selection of individuals who had expertise in transportation that could complement, if you will, a balance that clearly called for a determination on just what is the economic viability of the route. And we did Greg mentioned a little reference here in my pile of junk to the effort at that time. And this was the little brochure that we did. I'm going to get it reprinted and updated, but it was the Rails to Resources. And some of you may have a copy. I was looking back again at it the other day, and it's interesting how after you leave something for a while, you come back and start thinking, wow, that's a pretty good point you made back then. Why didn't you follow through and get it done? And the facts of it are, at that particular time, while the Canadian government was approached, they shelved it and said that they were proceeding with other alternatives to move petroleum products out of Canada for the time being, and wanted to get back to it later. But this calls for the United States and Canada federal support for the completion of new elements of transcontinental, interstate, and interprovincial railroad. They acknowledged that the westward movement was halted before rail connections were established. To both public and private lands in Alaska, the Yukon Territory, and northern British Columbia included lands held by the Aboriginal people, contain extensive deposits of oil and gas. It goes on to say rail transportation systems are capable of moving this cargo, and the extension of the continental rail system through northern British Columbia, Yukon Territory to Alaska would benefit significantly both nations, and the extension of the Alaska Railroad system with the Canadian border is consistent with the intent of Congress. And this is important too, because this goes back to my opening statement. We had 1,000 miles authorized by Congress. We only built 500 miles of it. The membership, as I indicated, was 20 members. The expertise associated with those members' requirements for selection. In general, the agreement would provide an appointment of a staff and executive director. It would require an office that sets up federal compensation, meeting schedules, procurement, and duties associated with the commission. But there's a couple of other interesting points that oftentimes are overlooked, and that's the commencement and termination of the commission. Now, as much as this commission was never initiated, it's kind of interesting to see where we are on the authorization. And the commencement says the agreement should provide for the commission to begin to function on the date on which all members are appointed to the commission as provided for in the agreement. Well, they were never selected, so it's still open. The termination, the committee shall terminate 90 days after the date on which the committee substitutes its report under section 6. Okay, so you're of $6 million to initiate the start of the commission. I point that out with a little more detail than probably goes with your luncheon, but I think it's important to recognize that this is a kind of jumping off point of legitimacy to have a piece of legislation that's already passed the Congress and to move the burden over to our Canadian neighbors and say, hey, now we got a bill here. We'd like to have you join us in this effort, and here's kind of an outline for you to consider. Now that's where we are, and I happen to know that last week when our Secretary of State was in Alaska, that he was briefly on the concept. And the question of the concept needs a little clarification, I'm sure, and that is, how do you go about reaching the Canadians with this message? Well, there's a protocol set up for it, and the protocol suggests that our congressional delegation be notified by our governor of the interest of the state to pursue this with the Canadians. And then our congressional delegation would communicate that formally to the State Department, and the State Department then would communicate it under the protocol to the Canadian government formally. And I've had some conversations with the governor, and the governor said that he would agree to that process. And as a consequence, the fact that Rex Tillerson just happened to be up in Alaska, and there were a few folks that had an opportunity to spend a little time on an airplane with him, had an opportunity to communicate that this might be coming from the state, from the delegation to the State Department. So I just want to point that out as to identify the process to bring this to the State Department. Now, there are several other things that I could go into, but I'll leave you with what I think is the most topical issue that just came up in the last 2 days, and that is the Canadian government's action on bill, they call it C-48, and its application on energy exportation out of Canada is quite profound. I'll just read you a little bit of background on it, because this is as a consequence of commitments made by the current administration in Canada relative to hydrocarbons and the movement of hydrocarbons out of certain areas of Canada. So this was more or less delivering on an election promise to formalize a crude oil moratorium on British Columbia's north coast. So last week, the central government of Canada introduced C-48. It's called the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. The legislation will prohibit oil tankers carrying crude and persistent oils as cargo from stopping, loading, or unloading at ports or marine installations in northern British Columbia. Now, where's northern British Columbia? Well, it kind of ends at Dixon Entrance, which is just north of Prince Rupert, and goes down to the end of Vancouver Island. It says the moratorium will extend from the Canadian-United States border in the north down to the point on British Columbia's mainland adjacent to the northern tip of Vancouver Island, and also include an area referred to as Haida Gwa. Vessels carrying less than 12,500 metric tons of crude or persistent oil as cargo would continue to be permitted in the moratorium area to ensure the northern communities can receive critical shipments of heating oils and other products. The legislation proposes strong penalty provisions for contravention that would reach up to $5 million for each incident. The legislation also proposes flexibility for amendment. Further refined petroleum products can be removed from the list on the basis of science and environmental safety and so forth. It concludes by saying this is just one of the actions of the Government of Canada is taking to protect our coasts and waterways. The government is also investing $1.5 billion in Ocean Protection Plan, a national strategy to create a world-leading marine safety system that provides economic opportunities for Canadians today while protecting our coastlines for future generations. Now, the significance of that suggests that an awful lot of deposits in Alberta and other areas of northern British Columbia and potentially the Yukon Territory are going to be, I guess to use a fisheries term, corked. In other words, not have access to the markets of the Pacific because they have no port. Prince Rupert, which is a port I know quite well, has a big export of coal, of grain. My understanding is they're basically plugged. They can only handle about 3 more trains a day, but they would be precluded from exporting oil out of Prince Rupert or Kitimat or other potential. So what this does, I believe, is make a significant case expanding the interests of not only resource developers, but the economic impact of what this railroad would mean for northern British Columbia, Yukon Territory, and Alaska. I've got a meeting in Vancouver the end of this month, and hope to meet with some of the Canadian officials to get their feel for the impact of what this embargo does. Now, this isn't law yet, but the significance of it is that it is the ruling party that's proposing it. And when the ruling party proposes, more often than not, it is already greased, so to speak. So that's kind of what's new, and I've gone on, and I could go on a lot longer to give you a lot more detail and flip pages and choke on the microphone, but I think it might be more spirited to get some questions. But again, I want to emphasize my energy and efforts are involved solely in bringing the two governments together, focusing in the consideration of the merits of what this could mean for Canada and the United States and our state of Alaska. I might mention, in addition, there seems to be some renewed interest in ANWR, which is not surprising with the current administration in Washington, D.C. The only thing I would caution is that the last go-around, I think they proposed just 2,000 acres. And I think that would be a mistake if we get some momentum to limit it there, because we've already seen in the OCS activity, which Mickey can talk about if she doesn't choke on her sandwich, me being almost in the right place, but just a little bit left or right of the pot of gold. So anyway, I'm starting to ramble, and let's get some questions. And you want to moderate?
Sure.
Give you something to do.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Governor. Okay, we've got a great chance here. Who would like to ask a question? Here's one.
I'm just curious, from your perspective, what's more likely, this project ending at Fort McKenzie or in Delta?
Well, it could be both, very frankly. If you identify them, at this stage of the development, a lot of the technology associated with bringing the bitumen, say, to Delta, is the mechanical process of breaking it down and recovering oil and putting oil in the pipeline. Now, I've got a study here that shows that they can move up to 1 million barrels a day. Now, when you look at the pipeline at what, 550,000 barrels a day or something like that, and our concern over decline of the pipeline, and if it gets below 300,000 barrels a day, the economics get a little washy, and you might have to lose it. There's a lot of environmentalists that would like to see it gone. So those are all factors. On the other hand, if you move it by rail to Point McKenzie, you're going to export it out of there, and the decision as to what route is going to be conceived, if indeed it's going to be developed, is going to be dependent on the economics of it. In other words, where do you get the highest return on your product? And there's arguments in both places, and it might be enough for both. So I wouldn't rule it out by any means. The fact that you've got two potential outlets, that's one of the advantages. The fact that the Canadians are limiting their ports to oil tankers is another factor that benefits these two ideas. The significance of Valdez, it's a proven world-class port. It's got huge capacity. It's been permitted. It's got an operating history, and you couldn't replace it probably for several billions of dollars today if you could get it even permitted.
Other questions? There in the very back.
Yeah, a few years back, economic think tank called Ambit, on the federal dollar, did a feasibility study of a similar nature to the economic viability of the link to Canada. And in addition to the natural resource extraction issues that Canada faces and the return freight that would bring, they also discovered that Asia, a lot of the Asian manufacturers and Asian shippers were very interested in using Alaska, especially South Central here, Point Mac, and Anchorage as a redistribution hub for the entire North American continent, finding they could save 7 to 10 days by docking here at millions of dollars a year and redistributing all their goods throughout North America. And that would beget a redistribution warehousing economy in Alaska that would bring a boon of the guesstimate was probably $11 billion a year annually to the state. And they also found that a lot of these Asian participants were interested in matching funds and investing in our infrastructure and our capabilities in so doing. Has that been taken off the table? Is that no longer part of it at all?
I'm glad you brought that question up because I overlooked it in my remarks. No, it is not being overlooked. It is a potential of a magnitude that's pretty hard to even forecast, because what's happening is many of our West Coast ports are being plugged by container cargo coming in from the Orient. And that includes Vancouver and Seattle, Tacoma, Los Angeles, San Francisco to a degree, and another port that I happen to spend a little time at, a place called Manzanilla, Mexico. They're bringing in about 4 container ships a day into that port and moving the cargo into Mexico City and up through St. Louis in a connection to the railroad there. But these ports, are under a lot of stress to try and accommodate the traffic. There's demurrage on ships that have to lay there and wait to get cleared is a cost of doing business. And you pointed out that there is a benefit of the sailing time. It's about 3.5 to 4 days depending on a number of factors, but you put that on a round trip and you're looking at the better part of a week. So that is a factor, and what that would do would give the railroad a backhaul, because a lot of this cargo is relatively what they call low revenue cargo. In other words, it doesn't have to go by FedEx. It can go by slow boat, and that's why it's going, because it's cheaper that way. But anytime you're cutting the distance down and you have a rail connection, you have the potential of a significant amount of backhaul containers, and that would affect Port of Anchorage, Port of Seward, Whittier, as well as across the inlet here at Point McKenzie. Now, what Point McKenzie needs, they need a 30-mile extension. And the railroad is not as financially well off as it was at various other times, nor is the state. The railroad has a bonding authority, a tax-exempt bonding authority, an unlimited amount, but you still have to sell the bonds and they still have to go out at a rate, and you have to have a viable project. But I think it's in the interest of Alaska to try and tie in and recognize the merits of that extension from Wasilla down to Point Mackenzie, because the right-of-way is there, the port's laid out, and it really needs that extension. And you might be able, you've got a gas line in there. You could move gas, LNG potentially by rail up to Fairbanks, or there's various other thoughts. But these are the kind of thing that are tough to do when you can't identify the tonnage right now, or you can't get a contract to amortize the investment right now, but it's needed. And the railroad's purpose has always been a development railroad, and that's the first stage that I think has to go.
Other questions? Other questions? How about right here?
Governor Tim Gallagher, just curious what the rough order of magnitude cost of a project like this is.
Well, I'll start by reminding some of you old timers that TAPS was supposed to come in just under $1 billion. And Joe Henry would remember where it came in. It came in at what, 6 to 7, something like that, depending.
9 billion.
Well, he was up to 9 now, so he got more fingers than I do. These are the estimates, and they run, 20 billion. Some of them run up to 28 billion, depending on. When you think about it, that's pretty big money, because we remember TAPS. TAPS was the largest project in North America at the time. This would be obviously more than TAPS, but you're looking at if these mineral deposits develop, and they certainly will. You're looking at a long-term contract to move product, and then you see the multiplication on that if you get into the bitumen. Where are the problems? Okay, I spent a lot of time with my banker's hat on. Okay, and when I put my banker's hat on, the world looks very real. And I can tell you that Alberta's got billions of acres of bitumen potentially, and I use that figuratively. But when I talk to who's got the leases, well, I've talked to Exxon, BP, ConocoPhillips, Shell, others. They got some leases, but they're not just sure of the technology. They're not just sure of the market. And the bottom line is, how are you going to move it? So they don't spend a lot of time agonizing. Now, you got to put the banker's hat on the other side and say, okay, who's going to buy this stuff? Well, it's going to be Asia. Who in Asia? Who's ready to sign a long-term contract? Well, they're out there, and I said, well, fine. I want to meet them. I want to talk to them. I want to see their financial. Is the government behind them or whatever? Bottom line, folks, this railroad will not be built if the two governments don't come together and recognize it as a priority. It's just too big a project, and I'm going to go see my buddy Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett tried through one of his henchmen. What was the guy's name that they fired after a while, Joe? Mid-America he had. He wanted an exclusive. At the time we were trying to build a natural gas pipe, not an LNG, a natural gas pipe. He wanted an exclusive, 6-month exclusive. I told him there's no way we're going to give anybody an exclusive to go out and shop the deal. I went back to have lunch with Warren, and we had a nice lunch. There was, I think, grilled cheese sandwiches and Coke put on a ping pong table in the back room of the hotel in Nebraska. It was the worst lunch I ever had, I think. But we had a good meeting and a lot of discussion and so forth and so on. But seriously, this is kind of a project that might interest that substantive, long-term investor in a private contribution as long as government's with them. Because, look. So the sky's the limit, and that's what gets you up in the morning.
Time for one more question.
And clearly, the Yukon Territory is, you know, stymied, northern British Columbia, now Alberta. But the significance of this action by the Canadian government in power on limiting access out of their ports makes a real quandary for those leaseholders and those potential investors in various parts of Western Canada. Where are they going to look to get the petroleum products out? And I think that's the opportunity we have to capitalize, if you will, on the circumstances and watching that legislation.
Thank you once again, Governor. Thank you for being here today. A reminder, we'll be here tomorrow at noon. Michael Bork from Bannockburn, Global Forex, will be talking about the Forex market and